$38 trillion. That's not just a number, it's a signal. A signal that the weight under our feet is growing heavier, and that many of tomorrow's choices have already been spent today, and that in the middle of this fourth-turning storm, economic stress isn't just a policy debate. It's something people are living through every single day. This week, we're going to slow down and look at what's happening. Not just on balance sheets and in the headlines, but in homes, on sidewalks, and across our civic memory. We'll ask what this pressure is doing to people, what it says about us, and what we might do next. Because every crisis tells a story. The question is, who will finish it? You see, right now, the federal government is shut down, as I'm recording this at least, and hundreds of thousands of workers are on hold. Public services have been paused or scaled back, and even basic government data, like inflation reports, had to be rescheduled. This week, the Bureau of Labor Statistics released September's inflation numbers, and they had to move the release date to make sure Social Security could calculate next year's cost of living adjustments on time. That's how fragile things are right now. Routine data, essential programs, all waiting for the lights to come back on. The headline inflation rate has cooled slightly, but core costs like food, rent, and other essentials remain high. People are still paying more and getting less. Mortgage rates are hovering in the low sixes, and for many young families, the idea of a first home feels farther out of reach than ever. Across multiple states, there are growing warnings about food assistance, and some states have announced that November's SNAP benefits may be delayed or paused if the shutdown continues. WIC programs, which support pregnant women and young children, have so far stayed afloat through temporary tariff revenue, but they're under growing strain, and the uncertainty alone is stressful. This isn't some abstract policy fight. It's people wondering how they'll afford groceries, whether their rent will jump again, and how long this economic tightrope can hold. And underneath it all, the national debt has crossed $38 trillion. The debt didn't come from nowhere. It's the result of decades of decisions, some made in crises, and some made carelessly, and many made without thinking about the long term. Back in 2000, the total U.S. debt stood at under $6 trillion. By 2010, it had more than doubled. And by 2020, as the pandemic hit, it was approaching $27 trillion. During Donald Trump's first term, the gross national debt rose by roughly $7.8 trillion. That included pandemic relief and military spending and sweeping tax cuts. And since his return to office in January, we've added another $1.8 trillion. That's in just 10 months. And as interest rates have risen, so has the cost of carrying that debt. In fact, net interest payments are now approaching $1 trillion a year, rivaling defense spending and creeping toward Medicare levels. Interest is now the second largest item in the federal budget, after Social Security. We are paying to carry that debt, and we're not slowing it down. Now, debt isn't inherently evil. It can be strategic. It can help in times of need, but it can also become a burden, a weight that limits what we can do tomorrow because of what we refused to reckon with yesterday. The founders didn't all agree on this either. George Washington warned against ungenerously throwing upon posterity the burden which we ourselves ought to bear. James Madison believed that excessive public debts posed a threat to Republican liberty and self-governance. But Alexander Hamilton saw something different. In his 1790 report on public credit, he argued that a well-managed debt could actually strengthen the Union, that honoring our obligations, consolidating what was owed, would create stability, attract investment, and bind the states together in a shared project. So, even then, public debt was a tension between investment and restraint. between risk and credibility, or between short-term needs and long-term stewardship. That's the tension we're living in now. Quick break, if you value this kind of grounded civic storytelling, please consider supporting it directly. At dancoyle.com/sustain, you'll find a way to join a growing community of people who believe history and integrity still matter. There's also a section called Featured Work on the homepage where I've gathered unique content created for you, and you might find something pretty interesting there. Again, just find it right on the homepage. All right, everything I make is a gift. It's not paywalled. So your support helps keep it that way. Thanks for being here. So, this isn't the first time America has carried too much weight at a dangerous moment. In the 1780s, after the Revolutionary War, the new nation was financially paralyzed. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress had no power to tax. And so war debts piled up, trade was chaotic, and in Massachusetts, veterans and farmers faced foreclosure and crushing taxes. And what followed was Shays' Rebellion, an armed uprising that closed courts and sent a wave of fear through the political class. That rebellion was more than economic protest. It was a turning point, a signal that the new republic was falling apart already. And it helped push the country toward drafting a constitution that could centralize power and stabilize finances and prevent collapse. 80 years later, during the Civil War, the Union government needed to fund an enormous conflict. So Congress passed the Legal Tender Act of 1862, creating the first national paper money, greenbacks. And with the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864, the government built a standardized, bond-backed banking system to help finance the war and unify the economy. And then came the 1930s. The Great Depression wiped out savings. Banks failed by the thousands. People lost faith in the financial system. Franklin Roosevelt's Emergency Banking Act restored trust by temporarily closing banks and reopening only those deemed sound and creating federal oversight. And by the end of that year, the Glass-Steagall Act had established the FDIC, finally ensuring deposits and giving people a reason to put their money back into banks. In each case, economic collapse wasn't just a problem, it was a trigger, a forcing function. It revealed what was broken and forced institutional redesign. And it's no accident that each of these moments aligned with a fourth turning, a generational period of upheaval and risk and renewal. This week, we find ourselves at another hinge. We're in a federal shutdown. Our debt just passed $38 trillion. $1 trillion a year in interest is eating into what we can afford to do next. So in short, we face a massive policy cliff. All of this is happening without a shared vision, without a plan for what kind of economy we want to build, or what we're trying to leave behind. We've entered a moment of pressure without alignment, and that makes everything more fragile. The longer we borrow from the future without owning the costs, the harder the landing becomes. There's a question that I keep coming back to. Not just how much do we owe, but what do we owe each other? We owe our kids more than just a functioning spreadsheet. We owe them resilience, institutions that work, a country that still believes in accountability and possibility. We owe each other truth about what's broken, about how we got here, and about what it's going to take to make things whole again. Because at the end of every fourth turning, there's a choice. Some nations fall apart, and some find their footing. Maybe debt isn't just a financial number. Maybe it's a moral weight, a civic signal, a chance to decide what kind of people we want to be in the face of strain. We can't erase the pressure we feel right now, but we can face it with integrity. All right, folks, thanks for walking through this one with me, and I'll see you in the next one.